There's a door up on Ruination Creek that stayed locked for 3 years. Not bolted from the outside, the way you'd lock a thing in. I want you to hold on to that because I didn't understand it either, not for a long time. Everybody in that valley had a story about what Silas Rude kept behind it. Some said his wife's body, preserved in salt like a hog. Some said gold. Some said nothing at all, that he'd gone soft in the head and was guarding an empty room the way a dog guards a bone that's already been eaten. I was the one who broke it open. October of '86, with the roof coming down and the heat peeling the skin off my forearms, and I put a splitting maul through 3 years of Silas Rude's silence. What I found in there has cost me sleep for 11 winters now. I've told this story exactly twice, once to a priest who didn't want it and once to my daughter who deserved better. This will be the third time and the last. I'll tell it the way it happened, in the order it happened, which means for a while you're going to think Silas was a monster. That's fair. I thought so too. Just when you get to the part about the door, remember which side the lock was on. The fire took the kitchen first. That's what I remember clearest, and it makes no sense, because the fire is not the part that matters. But memory doesn't care what matters. It grabs whatever's brightest and holds on like a burr in a horse's tail. The kitchen went up, and the flames came through the window glass sideways, flat, like water poured out of a bucket, and I stood in Silas Rude's dooryard with my reins in one hand and my mouth hanging open like a fool. Then I saw Silas. He wasn't running out. That's the thing. Every man I ever met, when a house burns, he runs out and he takes what he can carry, and he stands in the yard and watches his life turn into a column of smoke, and he says nothing because there's nothing to say. That's the natural way of it. That's what a man does. Silas Rude was running in. He came around the north side of the house at a dead sprint, 61 years old, one hip that had never set right after a horse rolled on him in '79, and he went straight past the door of his own home, past his own front door, which was standing open, with everything he owned inside it going to ash. He went past it like it was a fence post. He ran to the addition on the back. I'd seen that addition maybe 40 times in the 6 years I'd been his neighbor and never once thought about it. It was a room, that's all. Squat little thing hung off the back of the house like a tick on a hound, built out of green lumber that had warped and left gaps you could push your thumb into. Shake roof. No window on the outside. One door. He hit that door with his shoulder, and it didn't move. He hit it again. I was still standing there. I want to be honest about this part because I've dressed it up before and I'm done doing that. I was still standing in the yard with my reins in my hand, watching a 61-year-old man throw himself against a door, and I did not move because a piece of my mind, a small, cold, calculating piece I'm not proud of, was saying, "Whatever's in there, Cal, is not yours." Then the fire went into the roof of the addition, and Silas started screaming. Not words. I want to say he was shouting a name because that's how it goes in the stories, but he wasn't. It was a sound with no language in it, the sound a steer makes when the knife's already in and it knows, and it went through me the way cold goes through a wet shirt. I dropped the reins. My mare bolted. I never saw that horse again, and I've never much cared. I hit the door beside him, and it was like hitting a stump. "Move," I said. He didn't hear me. I put a hand on his shoulder and he swung on me, actually swung, a wild looping punch that caught my ear and rang it, and his eyes were nothing I'd ever seen in a human face. Then they cleared, just a little, just enough for him to see it was me, Cal Brannock, the fool from up the creek who owed him $40. "Maul," he said, his voice had gone to gravel, "woodpile go." I went. I should say who I am, since I'm going to be in this the whole way through, and you might as well know what kind of man is telling it to you. My name is Calvin Brannock. In 1886 I was 34 years old and I ran 200 and some head on a lease up the Ruination drainage in the White Mountain country, high enough that we got snow in the aspen while the valley below was still green. I was not a good rancher. I was a stubborn one, which people confuse for the same thing. I keep a ledger. That's the part everybody laughs at. I've kept one since I was 19, and it isn't a diary. I want that understood. I'm not a man who writes down his feelings. It's debts. That's all it is. Left column, what I owe. Right column, what's owed to me. Names and numbers and the date it was settled. My father died in Missouri owing 11 men money, and every one of those 11 men came to the funeral, and I watched them stand over his box with their hats in their hands doing arithmetic behind their eyes. I was 14. I decided, standing in that mud, that no man would ever do that math over me. So I keep the ledger, and in the margins, because the pages were expensive and I hate waste, I write the weather. Oct. 14, 1886. Clear wind hard from the SW afternoon. Owed S. Rude $40. That's the last thing I wrote before the fire. I know because I still have the book. It's on the shelf above me right now, and if I stood up I could open it and show you where the writing goes strange, 4 pages on, because my right hand was burned and I was learning to write with the left. Now Silas Rude came into that valley in '83 and bought the old Fenner place for cash money, which was the first thing people held against him. He was a big man gone stringy with age, gray-bearded, and he had a way of looking at you like he was checking your teeth. He didn't drink. He didn't come to the Sunday thing that Mrs. Dowd held in her front room and pretended was a church. He bought his flour and his coffee at Dowd's store on the first Tuesday of every month, said please and thank you, and went home. In 3 years, I don't believe I heard him volunteer a single fact about himself that wasn't extracted from him with a crowbar. Men like that in a country like that get a story built around them whether they want one or not. The country abhors a vacuum, and Silas Rude was a vacuum with a beard. Here's the story they built. He'd had a wife. That much was true, apparently. There was a woman with him when he came, and she was sick, and she died that first winter, and he buried her himself up in the rocks without asking anybody to help or even to come. Nobody saw the body. Nobody saw the grave. And in the spring, he built that addition on the back of the house, and he put a door on it, and he put a lock on the door. And every winter for 3 years, when the passes closed and there was nothing to do but sit and let a story rise like bread, the men in the back of Dowd's store would work on it. Sometimes it was the wife's body in there. Sometimes it was a woman he'd stolen. Emmett Dowd himself, who was a decent man in the way a barrel of nails is decent, once told me with total sincerity that Silas had gold from a stage robbery in Nevada, and that he sat in that room at night counting it. I never believed any of it, and this is the part I'd give a good deal to change, I never said so either. I sat there in the warm and let the story get built, and I laughed at the right places because I was 34 and the winters were long and it cost me nothing. It cost me nothing. The maul was in the woodpile, sunk in a round of oak, and I had to put my boot on the round and rock it 3 times to work it loose. It felt like an hour. It was probably 5 seconds. The whole back of the house was going by then, and the shake roof on that addition was catching in a way that shakes catch, not burning so much as arriving at fire, all at once, whump, like a match head. Silas was still on the door. He'd torn his hands. He was hitting the boards flat-palmed and yelling into the gap between them, and the gap was breathing smoke out at him, and he was breathing it in and yelling anyway. Now here's the detail. This is the one I want you to hold. He wasn't yelling, "Let me in." He was yelling, "Unlock it." I shouldered him aside and swung. The maul is 8 pounds, and I'd been splitting my own wood for 6 years, and I put every bit of it into the hasp side. The wood was green, warped, unseasoned. It should have gone like a cracker. It didn't. It took me 4 swings, and on the 3rd one my hand slipped on the haft and I hit the iron and the shock went up my arm and into my teeth, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that shames me, this is going to hurt tomorrow. 4th swing, the board split. And behind it, behind the door in the smoke, I saw why the maul hadn't worked. There was a bar across the inside. a piece of 2x4 dropped into brackets, the way you'd bar a door against wolves, against men, against anything that wanted in. Barred from the inside. I stood there for a full second with my mouth open like a landed trout, and Silas Rude shoved past me and got his arm through the split board up to the shoulder, and the flames were on the underside of the roof, and the whole room was orange, and he lifted that bar out of its brackets one-handed, and the door swung open and he went in. You want to know what was in there? I'll get to it, but I have to tell it the way I got it, or you'll get it too fast and it won't land right, and this thing deserves to land. Because here's the truth about that door. I went in behind him, and for maybe 3 heartbeats I couldn't see anything at all. Smoke, thick as wool, and heat that made my eyeballs feel dry as stones. My ears were roaring. I got low, which I'd like to say was skill and was actually panic, and from down there under the smoke layer I could see about 1.5 feet of clear air, and in that 1.5 feet I saw the floor of a room. Swept, it was swept. That's what got me. That's the thing I'd think about at 4 in the morning for the next 11 years. The floor was swept, and there was a rag rug on it, faded and worn thin at one end where feet had come and gone, and along the far wall there was a rope bed with a blanket folded, squared off at the corners at the foot of it. And there were things on the wall. Drawings, charcoal on the raw boards, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, layered over each other where the wall had run out of room. Horses, a lot of horses, and mountains that I recognized that were our mountains, the ruination ridge with the notch in it that we call the sight because you can look through it and see clear to the blue. Somebody had drawn that ridge from memory over and over and gotten it exactly right. Then Silas was dragging something and I stopped seeing anything at all because the roof came in. He got him out. Silas Rude, 61 years old, bad hip, got him out. I helped for the last part, got a hand under an arm and hauled. And then we were in the dooryard on our backs in the cold grass, with the whole house roaring behind us like a train going by. And I was coughing so hard I thought something inside me had torn loose, and I turned my head sideways in the dirt and looked at what we'd pulled out of there. A young man, 19, maybe 20. Apache, Western Apache, and though I didn't have any of those words then, I just thought Indian, and my whole body did something I'm ashamed of. He was long and thin, and his hair was cut short and ragged, sawed off with a knife by somebody who wasn't good at it. He was wearing white man's clothes that fit him badly. He was unconscious, and his hands were burned, and there was blood coming out of one ear. And Silas Rude was holding his head off the ground, both hands, cradling it the way you'd hold something you'd dropped once already. Then Silas looked up at me. I've thought a lot about what was in that look. I was a young man and I read it as a threat. Say nothing, do nothing. And there was some of that in it, sure. But I'm older now than he was that night, and I've buried people, and I know what I was actually looking at. He was waiting to be told what happened next. He had no more moves. He'd spent them all on the door. And he was looking at me, at Cal Brannock, the fool from up the creek, 34 years old and full of opinions, because I was the entire world in that moment, the whole of society and its judgment condensed down into one coughing idiot in a burned shirt, and whatever I did in the next minute was going to be the rest of both their lives. I said the stupidest thing I have ever said, before or since. I said, Silas, what have you done? 3 days before, I'd ridden down to pay him $40. That's why I was there at all, and I want to be clear that it was not neighborliness. It was the ledger. He'd loaned me the money in June to buy a bull from the Halloran outfit. No interest, no note, no witness, just counted it out on the seat of his wagon and said pay me when the calves sell, and drove off before I could thank him, which I'd found insulting at the time. The calves had sold. It was the 14th of October. The money was in my coat. I found him in his corral working a colt on a lunge line, and he made me stand there 20 minutes before he acknowledged me, which was pure Silas. Brannock, brought your 40. He took it, counted it, folded it into his shirt. He watched the colt go around and around and said, wind's coming. Feels like it. And then he said, not looking at me, "You keep a book," Emmett says, writes everything down in a book. I felt my neck get hot. It's a ledger. The Colt went around. What's it say about me? I said, and God help me, I thought I was being funny. Says you're square with everybody in this valley, and that's a suspicious thing in a man. Silas Rude stopped the Colt. He turned around and he looked at me for a long, long moment, and something moved in his face that I could not read at all. It wasn't anger. If it had been anger, I'd have understood it. It was closer to hunger. Like I'd said something he'd been starving for, and he was deciding whether he could risk swallowing it. "No," he said, "I ain't square with anybody." And he went back to the Colt. I rode home. In the margin I wrote "Clear, whined hard from the SW afternoon," and I put a line through the $40, and I thought about that hungry look for about 90 seconds, and then I thought about a fence I had to fix instead. That's what a man's mind does. It moves on. 3 days later his house burned down, and I found out what he wasn't square with. The boy, I called him a boy, everybody did, and I'd give a lot to take that back too, came around near dawn in my lined shack, which was the nearest roof standing. Silas had carried him half a mile. I'd offered twice to take a turn, and both times he'd said no in a voice that closed the subject. I had a fire going. My hands were wrapped in strips of a shirt. The right one was bad, blistered from wrist to knuckle where I'd gripped the maul haft after the iron shock, and it was starting to talk to me. The boy opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, and did not move a single other muscle. Then very quietly, he said something in Apache. Silas answered him. In Apache. Badly, even I could hear it was badly. The way a man speaks a language he learned in the field and never in a kitchen, but he answered him, and the boy's eyes went sideways to him, and I watched something pass between those two that I had absolutely no right to be in the room for. The boy said something else. Silas shook his head. The boy said it again, sharper. Silas said in English to the ceiling, "He wants to know why you're here." "I live here," I said, which was true and which was, I realize now, not what was being asked. The boy turned his head and looked at me. He had a burn coming up on his cheekbone, and he looked at me with an expression I have spent 11 years failing to describe. There was no fear in it. That's what undid me. I'd expected fear, and there was none, and what was there instead was a kind of terrible, patient assessment, the look a man gives a horse he's going to have to ride whether he likes it or not. He said in English slowly, like the words had been kept somewhere damp and were coming out warped, "You will tell them." Not a question. I said, "Tell who?" He closed his eyes, and Silas Rude put his face in his ruined hands and said, "Because he thinks you're a man, Brannock, and that's what men do." Here's what I got out of him that night in pieces, with long silences in between that I've filled in since with things I learned later, and I'll tell you plain which is which. The pieces I got that night. Silas had been a scout, not a soldier, a scout contracted in the campaigns in the 80s, and he did not say for who or when, and I did not ask because I didn't know enough to ask. He said, I was good at it. He said it the way you'd confess to something. In '83, in a place he called Redbird Draw, which is on no map I've ever found, something happened. He would not say what. He said, there was a rancheria. Then nothing for so long that I thought he'd gone to sleep sitting up. Then, it was not a fight. Just that, it was not a fight. The boy had been 16. Silas found him under a brush shelter alive, with a woman dead across him who Silas said was probably his mother and might have been his aunt. He never knew and never asked, and by then it was over and there was nothing left to do that could be called a decision. And Silas Rude, a contracted scout of the United States Army, on a payroll with a rifle, picked that boy up and walked him out. 14 days. He said the boy did not speak once in 14 days. He said, I had a wife then. That was the whole story of his wife. 4 words, and the rest of it left in the dark where he wanted it. She was alive when they came into the White Mountains, and she was dead by the next spring. And my guess, mind, is that a woman doesn't die of nothing at 40 in good country, and that keeping a secret that size in a two-room house will kill a person as sure as consumption will. And the room. I asked about the room. I asked why a man builds a room with a lock on it. And Silas looked at me with such contempt that I felt it go through my chest and out my back. I built him a room, he said. I built the walls and he put the bar on the inside. You want to know why? Because he was 16 years old and he'd seen what men look like when they come out of the dark, and he was going to hear them coming before they got to him. He was shaking. 3 years, Brannock. 3 years he barred that door every night from the inside, and there wasn't one damn thing I could say to him that made him stop, because he was right. He wiped his mouth. He was right. If they'd come, I couldn't have stopped them. Never could have. And he said the last of it very quietly. That bar was the only true thing I ever gave him. The boy's name was Well. I asked. It took him a long while to decide to answer, and when he did he said it once, at speaking pace, and looked at me to see what I'd do with it. I got out my ledger. I did that because it's what I do, because when the world gets too big for me I put it in a book and rule a line under it. My right hand was wrapped, so I wrote left-handed, big shaky letters, and I wrote down what I'd heard. I turned the book around and showed him. And he read it, which surprised me so badly I flinched, and I saw him see the flinch, and then a thing happened to his face. Not a smile. The muscles around his eyes moved and something at the corner of his mouth pulled sideways, and he looked at Silas, and he said something short in Apache, and Silas made a sound that had a laugh buried somewhere down inside it under about 100 pounds of grief. What, I said, what'd I write? The boy took the pencil out of my hand. He crossed out what I'd written with 2 neat strokes. He wrote it again, correctly, in a clean, careful script that was better than mine. Then under it he wrote, "You spell like a horse." I sat in my line shack at dawn with my hands ruined in a burned house half a mile off, and a dead world coming up over the ridge, and I laughed until I had to hold my ribs. That's the thing nobody tells you. You can laugh in the middle of it. You can laugh right in the middle of the worst 3 days of your life, at a joke about your handwriting, and it doesn't mean you're a monster. It means the body wants to live even when the mind's still working on whether it deserves to. I've held on to that. It's about all I got out of this clean. The trouble came up the draw 2 days later, and it came the way trouble always comes in that country, slow and friendly and on horseback. Emmett Dowd and 4 men. They'd seen the smoke, of course. Everybody within 15 miles had seen the smoke, and they'd ridden over to Silas Rude's place to do what neighbors do, which is stand in the ashes and shake their heads and offer things they hope won't be accepted. And instead of a burned house with a dead man in it, they'd found a burned house with no man in it at all, and a set of tracks and something else. Emmett swung down at my door. He was 50, red-faced, kind to children and dogs. "Cal, that's a hell of a hand you got there." "It'll do. Sila's here." I did not look at the shack behind me. I have never in my life been so aware of a building. "Yeah." "He alive?" "Yeah." Emmett nodded slowly. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, around and around, and I remember the sound of his thumb going over the felt. He was working himself up to something, and it was costing him. "Cal," he said, "there was 2 sets of tracks come out of that house." The wind came down off the sight. Somewhere behind me in the shack, I heard the smallest sound in the world, a floorboard taking weight. "2 sets," Emmett said again, "one of 'em barefoot." He put his hat on. He looked at me with an expression of enormous, genuine, neighborly patience, the exact expression I'd worn myself for 6 years in the back of his store, while men built a story about a man they'd never spoken to. "Now," he said, "I know Silas is a strange one, and I ain't here to make trouble for a man's had a fire. But there's been Apache off the reservation since spring, and there's folks in this valley got children." He waited. I opened my mouth. And in that half-second before I said anything at all, I understood two things with a clarity that has never once left me. The first was that Emmett Dowd was not a bad man. He would go home tonight and read to his youngest. He believed every word he'd said. That's what made it unsurvivable. The second was that my ledger had two columns, and I had spent my whole life feeding the right-hand one, and I had never once in 34 years written down what I owed to somebody who couldn't come to my funeral and collect it. Behind me, the floorboard took weight again. I said, "Them's my tracks." Emmett Dowd's thumb stopped moving on the brim of his hat. Barefoot. Boots burned off me. I held up my right hand. The rag was brown at the knuckles and yellow where it wasn't brown, and it stank, and I had not looked under it in 2 days because I was afraid of what I'd find. You want to see the rest of me? That's the whole trick of it. I learned it right there in my own dooryard at 34 years old, and I've been sick about it ever since. A lie doesn't have to be good. It only has to be worse to look at than to swallow. Emmett's eyes went down to the hand and slid off it like water off a slate roof. He was a decent man. Decent men don't want to see the meat. "Well," he said, he cleared his throat. "Well, hell, cow." Behind me, in the shack, a floorboard took weight and let it go. Every man there heard it. There is a kind of silence that has a shape to it. This one had 5 men in it and a door at my back in about 4 seconds of time, and in those 4 seconds I watched Emmett Dowd decide, all on his own, without any help from me, that what he'd heard was a sick old neighbor turning over on a cot. I watched him decide it because deciding otherwise would have required him to walk past me, and to walk past me he'd have had to make me move, and he did not want, on that cold, bright morning, to be a man who made his neighbor move. He said, "Tell Silas we'll get a crew up, frame him a new place before the snow." "I'll tell him." "Cal," he was already turning. He stopped, and for one bad moment I thought it had all come apart, that he'd seen through it, that I'd have to find out what kind of man I actually was. He said, "Get that hand looked at. That's how a fella loses an arm." Then they rode off down the draw, 5 men with their coat collars up, and the last one Purcell, a boy of 19 who worked for Emmett and had never in his life had an idea somebody didn't hand him. The last one looked back. I want to be precise about that look, because I've built 11 years of dread on top of it, and it may be that I built it out of nothing. He looked back at the shack, not at me, at the shack. And then he looked at me, and he touched his hat and he rode on. I have thought 1,000 times about what I did in that dooryard, and I still cannot get it to sit in either column. I lied to a man who trusted me, and the lie kept another man alive. There's no arithmetic that resolves that. You can say the lie was righteous. I've said it to myself, in the small hours, in the voice I use when I'm trying to get to sleep, but the thing is, I didn't lie to save a life. Not in that first second. In that first second I lied because I was afraid, and the shape my fear took happened to be the shape of the right thing, and I have never got over the humiliation of being decent by accident. Silas knew. He was standing just inside the door with the shotgun. Not aimed, just held broken open over his arm, 2 brass ends showing. I came in and shut the door, and neither of us said anything for a long while. My knees had started going, and I sat down on the woodbox because it was there. "You'd have shot Emmett Dowd," I said. "No." "Then why?" "Because if he'd come through that door," Silas said, "the boy would have gone out the window, and then he'd have been a runner." He closed the gun. The click was very small. "You know what happens to a runner, Brannock. Nothing complicated. Nothing anybody has to think about. That's the whole point of making a man run." He put the gun in the corner and sat down across from me, and put his face in his hands and stayed that way. And from the back of the shack, from behind the blanket I'd hung across the corner because I hadn't known what else to do, a voice said, in that damp, warped English, I heard you lie. I said, yeah. A pause. You are bad at it. He got stronger and Sila's got worse. That's the shape of that winter and there's nothing I can do about it. The boy's burns closed up over about 5 weeks and the blood stopped coming out of his ear, and he'd sit by the stove with a blanket around his shoulders drawing on the backs of my old flour sacks with a pencil stub. Horses, mostly. Then the ridge. Then the notch in the ridge. And Silas coughed. He'd taken more smoke than either of us knew. It came on him slow, the way that does a rattle first, then a wetness, then whole nights where he sat bolt upright on the cot because lying down was drowning. By January he couldn't cross the room without stopping. He never once complained. I want that written down somewhere permanent. Silas Rude coughed up pieces of his own lungs into a rag for 4 months, and the closest he ever came to complaint was one night in February when he said, to nobody, "Ain't this a hell of a joke?" I asked him what was. He said I carried him 14 days out of the draw. 14 days, and I never set him down but once. He looked at his hands. And now I can't carry a bucket of water 40 feet. I said something stupid and comforting. He said, that ain't the joke, Cal. He was smiling, and it was the worst thing I ever saw on a human face. The joke is I want to be the one that carries him out again, even now, even like this. His breath went ragged and he let it. Man wants to be needed by the thing he broke. That's the joke. That's every damn one of us. The boy was in the corner. He'd stopped drawing. Now the decision. I've turned this over so many times the edges have worn off it, and I can't tell anymore if I've remembered it or invented it. But it happened in March, when the snow was rotting on the south slopes, and it was clear that Silas Rude was not going to see the aspen leaf out. The problem was simple, and it had no good end. The boy could not stay. Not in that valley, not with Purcell riding past my line fence twice a month for no reason a man could name. And he could not go, not alone, not on foot, not off reservation with no paper and no name and every rider between the site and the Gila entitled by law and custom to stop him and ask what he was and what he was doing there. There was exactly one way through it. I'd worked it out in my ledger in the margins, the way I work out everything. He needed to be written down. There were roles. Agency roles at San Carlos and elsewhere, lists of names, and if your name was on a list you existed, and if you existed you could be somewhere legally, and a man with a paper in his coat is a different animal from a man without one. I knew a clerk. I knew a lawyer in Hallbrook who'd done a thing for my father once. It would take money, and it would take lying, and it would take, at the end of it, this boy standing in a room in front of white men, saying his name out loud so that a white man could write it in a book. I laid it out for both of them at the table with my ledger open in front of me, because I think better with the columns showing. I was proud of it, God forgive me, I was proud of it. Silas didn't say anything. He looked at the boy. The boy looked at my ledger. He said, that is your book. It's a ledger. You write in it what you owe. That's right. He reached over. He turned it around so it faced him, and he set his finger on the left-hand column, the one I'd filled all my life, the debts I owed, every one of them ruled through in a straight line when it was paid. He said, in the drawer there was a book. The stove ticked. A soldier had it before, months before. He was speaking very slowly and choosing the words the way you choose your footing on scree. He came and he wrote us down, how many, our names, the men's names, where the water was. He drank our coffee. He looked up at me. He was not unkind. I want you to know he was not unkind. He gave my mother a needle. I had gone cold to the bottom of my feet. And then, he said, in the winter other men came and they knew how many we were, and they knew where the water was. He closed my ledger. He put his hand flat on the cover. You want to write my name in a book so I will be safe. His voice never rose, not once. Every one of my people who is dead was in a book first. Silas got up and went outside. I heard him coughing out there for a long time, and then I didn't hear anything. And after a while he came back in with his face wet and sat back down and didn't say a word about it. I sat there with my hand on my ledger and something coming apart in my chest. Because he wasn't wrong. That's the thing. I'd have given a good deal for him to be wrong, for it to be superstition, or ignorance, or fear I could talk him out of. It wasn't any of those. He'd reasoned it out from the evidence available to him, and he'd reached the correct conclusion, which was that in this country a written name is a tool, and tools have no opinions about what they're used for, and the man who hands you a tool does not get to decide what you do with it after. I had spent my whole life believing that a book of names and numbers was a way of being honest. It had never once occurred to me that it was a way of being found. I said, "Then what do you want?" And he said the thing I have never been able to put down. He said, "I want to go home, and there is no home, so I want to go toward it." He left on the 9th of April. Not at night, and not in secret, which I'd argued for and lost. He walked out of my dooryard at about 9 in the morning with the sun on him, wearing my second coat, carrying food he'd insisted on splitting exactly in half with me, and he went up the draw and not down it, up, toward the site, toward the high country where nobody runs cattle and there's nothing anybody wants. Silas couldn't stand. He'd tried. He'd gotten as far as the door frame and gone gray, and I'd caught him under the arms, and he'd fought me. This dying man fought me hard with the last of what he had because he wanted to walk to the fence. He didn't get to the fence. He sat propped in the doorway with a blanket over his knees like an old woman, and watched a young man walk up a draw, and I stood behind him with my hands on the frame, and neither of us said anything at all, because what was there? Twice the boy stopped. He didn't turn around either time. He just stopped and stood and then went on, and I have never known and will never know whether he was catching his breath or deciding something. At the top of the draw, where the trail bends around the shoulder of rock, and there's about 6 seconds when a man is skylined against the notch before he drops out of sight forever, he raised one hand. He didn't wave it, he just held it up. And Silas Rude, who could not stand and could not shout and could not carry a bucket of water 40 feet, lifted his own hand off the blanket and held it up, and kept it there, shaking, long after there was nobody on the ridge at all. Then he said, "Get me inside, Cal." He was dead in 11 days. I buried him up in the rocks next to the grave I found there, the one nobody in the valley had ever seen. 2 stones. No names on either of them, and I've come to think that was right, though at the time I only did it because I didn't know how to spell hers and there was nobody left to ask. Emmett Dowd came to the burying. So did 9 other people, and every one of them had spent 3 winters telling stories about the man in the box, and every one of them had brought food, and they were sorry. They were genuinely sorry, and I stood there in the wind and hated them so much my teeth ached. And then I went home and looked in a mirror and hated something else. Purcell asked me once, that summer, real casual, if I'd ever found out what Silas kept in that back room. I said gold. He said he knew it. 11 years. I married. I've got a daughter, and she's got her mother's hands and my stubbornness, which is a hard thing to wish on a child. The lease is mine now, bought outright. I run 400 head. My right hand never came all the way back, the 2 smallest fingers don't close, and I write with my left, which is why the pages after October of '86 look like a child's work and always will. I kept the ledger the whole time. Left column, right column, ruled lines. It's the only unbroken thing in my life. And on the last page of every book, when I've filled it, before I start a new one, I copy over the accounts that haven't settled. There's one that's never settled. It's been carried forward through 4 books now, and it's in the left-hand column, which is the debts, and it hasn't got a number next to it because I don't know what the number is. It's got a name. I'm not going to write it here. I've thought about it a long while, And there's a version of this telling where I give you the name and you carry it out of here and it becomes a thing people know, a thing in a book, and maybe somebody's great-grandchild reads it someday and knows he was real. I've wanted that. I've wanted it so bad it's kept me up. But he told me what a book does. He told me plain, at my own table, with his hand flat on the cover, and I have spent 11 years learning that he understood the world better at 19 than I do now. So it stays in my ledger. It's the only place it's written, and when I die my daughter will burn that book because I have asked her to, and she is a better person than her father and she will do it. Last spring a man came through buying horses. He'd come down from the north, up past the blue, and we sat on my porch and talked about nothing for an hour the way men do. He said the high country was empty. He said he'd gone 4 days without seeing sign of a soul. Then he said the strangest thing. He said up in the rocks under the notch, the site, he called it by name, which surprised me because that's a local word, there's a wall of stone and somebody's been drawing on it. Charcoal. Horses mostly. Been at it a long time, years by the look, layers over layers where the rock ran out of room. I got up and got him more coffee so he wouldn't see my face. He said, "Somebody lives up there, you think?" I said I doubted it. I said kids get up to things. He said, "Well, whoever it is can draw." And after he'd gone, I sat on the porch until it was full dark and my wife came out and asked what was the matter, and I said nothing, nothing. Come sit. I have not gone up there. I've saddled a horse to do it maybe 6 times. Once I got as far as the bend where the trail goes around the shoulder of rock, and I sat there in the wind for I don't know how long, and I thought about a hand held up against the sky, and I thought about what it would mean if I rode up there and found him and he looked at me the way he looked at me that first morning in the shack. You will tell them. And I could not swear, sitting there, that he'd be wrong. That's the thing I can't get past. He never once asked me to keep his secret. He asked me what kind of man I was, and I gave him an answer 11 years ago in a dooryard, out of fear, badly, and I have been trying to earn that answer ever since. So I turned the horse around. I keep thinking there's a way to write it down that makes it come out square. Left column, right column, ruled line. I've tried. But every time I get to the part about the door, about the bar, about the fact that a 16-year-old boy dropped it into its brackets every night of his life for 3 years, and Silas Rude let him, because Silas Rude was the reason and knew it, and the only gift he had left to give was the sound of that wood going home in the dark. Every time I get to that part, my hand stops. And I sit there, and the fire ticks down, and out the window the ridge goes black against the last of the light with that notch cut out of it like something taken. I don't know what he's drawing up there. I hope it's horses, I hope it's